On August 15, 1971, the modern financial world crossed a line that would quietly redefine global power for generations. In a brief televised address, the President of the United States announced that the dollar would no longer be convertible into gold. To most viewers, it sounded like a technical adjustment, a temporary measure to protect the American economy. In reality, it marked the end of the monetary order that had governed the world since the end of World War II. For decades, the Bretton Woods system had anchored international finance. Currencies were pegged to the US dollar, and the dollar itself was tied to gold. This arrangement imposed discipline. Governments could not print endlessly. Trade imbalances were constrained. Trust existed because the system was backed by something tangible. When the United States broke that link, the anchor disappeared. The immediate reaction was confusion rather than panic. Markets did not collapse. Governments complained, but quietly. The dollar survived the shock, and that survival created a dangerous illusion. It suggested that the dollar did not actually need gold to remain dominant. But survival was not the same as stability. Without gold, the dollar faced a fundamental problem. Why should the world continue using a currency backed only by the political credibility of a single country? Why should nations store their reserves in paper issued by a foreign government with its own interests? The answer did not come from economists or academic theory. It came from geopolitics. By the early 1970s, oil had become the most important commodity on Earth. Industrial production, transportation, food systems, and military power all depended on reliable access to energy. Control energy, and you influence everything else. American policymakers understood this reality with brutal clarity. Through quiet diplomacy, Washington reached a strategic agreement with Saudi Arabia, the world's most influential oil producer. The deal was simple and devastatingly effective. Oil would be sold exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would provide security guarantees, military protection, and political support for the Saudi state. The arrangement did not stop there. It soon expanded across OPEC. Oil, the bloodlife of modern civilization, was now priced in dollars by default. Any country that wanted energy first needed access to American currency. This solved the dollar's post-gold crisis instantly. Global demand for dollars became permanent and structural. Central banks accumulated US reserves not because they trusted America, but because the system required it. Trade deficits stopped weakening the United States. Instead, they exported dollars into a world that had no choice but to absorb them. The dollar transformed. It was no longer simply money. It became infrastructure, embedded in global trade, energy markets, and financial systems, invisible, unavoidable, and indispensable. This was the birth of the petrodollar system, quiet, elegant, and extraordinarily powerful. It allowed the United States to finance deficits, project influence, and shape the global economy without direct confrontation. For decades, the system delivered growth and relative stability, but it also concentrated unprecedented power in a single currency and a single state. That power remained largely invisible as long as it was not used, and that invisibility would not last forever. For most of its existence, the power of the dollar did not feel like power at all. It operated quietly, embedded deep inside global trade and finance, rarely noticed by ordinary people or even many governments. Banks cleared transactions in dollars because everyone else did. Contracts were written in dollars because it was convenient. The system felt neutral, technical, almost boring. As globalization accelerated, that quiet dominance deepened. International payments, debt markets, commodity trading, insurance, and capital flows increasingly passed through institutions connected to the United States. Clearing systems, correspondent banks, and settlement networks all relied on access to the dollar. This was not designed as a weapon. It was simply how efficiency evolved. But efficiency creates dependence, and dependence creates leverage. Over time, Washington gained something no previous empire had ever possessed. It gained visibility and influence over the plumbing of the global economy. Money did not just move through markets anymore, it moved through systems governed by American law, American regulators, and American political priorities. At first, this power was exercised cautiously. Sanctions existed, but they were limited and targeted. They were framed as exceptional responses to extreme behavior. The assumption was that finance remained separate from politics and that money was still neutral ground. That assumption slowly collapsed. The shift did not happen overnight. It happened decision by decision. A bank cut off here, an account frozen there, a transaction blocked quietly, without headlines or public debate. Each action was legally justified. Each one seemed reasonable on its own. Together, they changed the nature of the system. Assets held in dollars were no longer guaranteed to be usable. Reserves stored abroad were no longer fully sovereign. Governments began to realize that money inside the global system was not truly theirs if political alignment shifted. This was a psychological turning point. For the first time, money itself became conditional. Access depended not only on economic rules, but on political behavior. The dollar was no longer just a currency, it was an instrument of enforcement. The effects were devastating, and they did not require soldiers. Entire economies could be isolated without a single missile fired. Supply chains fractured, currencies collapsed, inflation surged, living standards deteriorated rapidly. Economic pressure replaced military confrontation as the preferred tool of coercion. The weapon worked because the world had no alternative. Energy was priced in dollars, trade settled in dollars, debt issued in dollars. Exiting the system was not just difficult, it was almost impossible. And so compliance followed. But power leaves traces. Every sanction planted doubt, every frozen reserve created fear, every blocked payment sent a signal far beyond its intended target. The message was clear. Participation in the global financial system was no longer unconditional. Trust began to erode quietly and unevenly, not all at once, not everywhere, but enough to matter. Central bankers started asking uncomfortable questions. Finance ministries ran scenarios once considered unthinkable. What if reserves were no longer safe? What if access could be revoked? What if neutrality no longer existed? The dollar still dominated global finance. Its share of reserves remained overwhelming. Its role in trade was intact. But something had changed beneath the surface. The system had crossed a psychological threshold. It was no longer built purely on trust. It was built on obedience. And systems based on obedience are stable only as long as fear outweighs alternatives. Once alternatives begin to appear, even imperfect ones, the balance starts to shift. The dollar had become extraordinarily powerful, but in becoming a weapon, it had also revealed its greatest weakness. The reaction to the weaponization of the dollar did not come as an open revolt. There were no dramatic announcements, no sudden abandonment of the system, no global conference declaring a new financial order. That would have been too risky. Instead, the response was quiet, fragmented, and deliberate. It began with hedging. Countries started diversifying their reserves, slowly reducing the share held in dollars while increasing holdings of gold and other currencies. These moves were cautious and often framed as routine portfolio management. Publicly, nothing had changed. Privately, the logic was clear. Dependence had become a liability. Bilateral trade agreements followed. Nations began settling transactions directly in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar where possible. At first, these deals were limited in scope. They covered specific sectors, specific partners, specific commodities. But each agreement weakened the assumption that the dollar was unavoidable.
Payment systems became the next frontier. Alternative clearing networks were developed to reduce reliance on US-controlled infrastructure. These systems were imperfect, fragmented, and less efficient than the dollar-based model, but efficiency was no longer the only priority. Control mattered more. The turning point came when frozen reserves stopped being a theoretical threat and became lived reality. When states saw sovereign assets rendered inaccessible overnight, the lesson was unmistakable. This was not about bad actors or exceptional cases. It was about structural vulnerability. Money that could be frozen was not fully sovereign. From that moment on, the logic of self-preservation took over. Governments began planning for scenarios they had once dismissed as impossible. What if access to dollars was suddenly restricted? What if settlement channels were blocked? What if neutrality disappeared entirely? Energy markets reflected this shift. OPEC producers became more open to alternative pricing mechanisms. Importers explored contracts settled outside the dollar framework. These experiments were small and cautious, but symbolically powerful. For the first time in decades, the pricing of energy was no longer treated as fixed. None of this meant the dollar was collapsing. Far from it. The dollar remained dominant, liquid, and deeply embedded in global finance. But dominance does not require collapse to weaken. It weakens when inevitability erodes. The world was not trying to overthrow the dollar, it was trying to survive it. This distinction matters. Revolutions fail. Adaptation endures. As more countries quietly adjusted their behavior, a new reality emerged. The dollar was still the center of the system, but it was no longer the only option being considered. Even imperfect alternatives became valuable simply because they existed. The petrodollar system, once seen as the backbone of stability, began to look increasingly rigid. What had once guaranteed order now limited flexibility. What had once reduced risk now concentrated it. This was the paradox. The very mechanisms that made the dollar powerful also made others want distance from it. The shift was slow, uneven, and often invisible, but it was real, and once it began, it fed on itself. Every sanction accelerated diversification, every freeze encouraged independence, every use of financial power taught others how exposed they really were. The system still functioned, trade continued, markets operated, but beneath the surface the incentives had changed. The world was no longer asking how to operate within the dollar system, it was asking how to live without being trapped by it. The petrodollar system was never designed to last forever. It was a solution to a specific historical crisis built for a particular moment in time. That moment has passed. The conditions that made the system stable are slowly disappearing, one by one. The first change is energy itself. The world that created the petrodollar was a world dependent on oil above all else. Today, energy markets are more complex, producers are more diverse, consumers are more strategic. Long-term energy contracts are being reconsidered, renegotiated, and redesigned. When the foundation shifts, the structure built on top of it cannot remain unchanged. The second change is geopolitics. The global order is no longer unipolar. Power is more fragmented, alliances are less stable, strategic competition is more open. In such an environment, dependence on a single financial center becomes a risk rather than a convenience. What once felt efficient now feels dangerous. Technology accelerates this shift. Digital payment systems, regional clearing networks, and new settlement mechanisms reduce reliance on centralized infrastructure. None of these systems are perfect. None can yet replace the dollar. But perfection is no longer required. Viability is enough. This is the core misunderstanding. The dollar does not need to collapse for the system to break, it only needs to lose inevitability. For decades, the strength of the dollar was not just economic, it was psychological. It was the assumption that there was no alternative. That assumption shaped behavior, reinforced habits, and stabilized expectations. Once alternatives exist, even flawed ones, the psychology changes. The paradox of weaponized finance becomes unavoidable. The more effective the weapon, the faster others learn to avoid it. Each use of sanctions reinforces the lesson. Each frozen asset strengthens the case for diversification. Each act of financial coercion accelerates the search for autonomy. This does not mean the dollar is finished. It remains dominant, it remains liquid, it remains deeply embedded in global markets. But dominance is not the same as permanence. History is full of systems that appeared eternal until they were not. The petrodollar's true foundation was never oil, it was trust. Trust that the system was neutral, trust that money was predictable, trust that participation did not require political obedience. That trust is now conditional. The future will not arrive with a single announcement or dramatic collapse. There will be no moment where the dollar suddenly disappears from global trade. Instead, there will be a long transition, a gradual rebalancing, a world where the dollar is one pillar among several rather than the pillar. In that world, the United States will still be powerful, the dollar will still matter, but the ability to dictate terms unilaterally will be reduced. Influence will need to be negotiated rather than enforced. This is how financial empires end, not with chaos, but with options. The petrodollar system is not dying because it failed, it is breaking because it worked too well, for too long, and was used too aggressively. And in global finance, the moment inevitability disappears, the end has already begun.